Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Business of Bioenergy, a podcast about building, growing, and running bioenergy companies. I'm your host, Jackie McAllen.
And I'm your co-host, Corey Woolard.
Today, we're talking about the global bioenergy landscape with a special focus on Asia and Africa. Bioenergy demand is rising globally, but not all regions are created equal. In this episode, we explore the evolving market for biomass like black pellets and what's driving demand outside of Asia and Europe. Our guest today is Maarten Gnoth, an expert on global biomass energy, biomass processing, and supply chain management and sustainability. Maarten is going to share the realities on the ground, including how local feedstocks, current infrastructure, and logistics gaps affect uptake, especially in high-growth regions like Asia and Africa.
Maarten, welcome to the show today.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. It's great to be on the show today.
We're extremely excited to have you to talk about what's happening in the biomass market outside of Europe and North America, which I think most people are kind of tuned into. So you've had a really interesting career, and now you're managing several projects in Africa. You've also got significant experience in Asia and Vietnam, for example. But to kick things off here today, tell us a little bit about your current projects and what you're specifically working on right outside in a little nation in the middle of the Indian Ocean, right?
Yeah, my background is utility and biomass in particular. And what I'm doing as an independent consultant myself now is working in Africa and Asia on various biomass-related projects. So either wood pellets or wood chips or even biochar. And it can be anything from producing fuel, so producing wood chips or wood pellet for power or heat, or a full conversion from biomass, so whatever kind of biomass, even up to agri-residues into power and heat. And most of my work is in Africa, Southern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, but also Asia.
That's fantastic. And what is the one project that you're working on? So me and Jackie kind of spoke to you earlier about, kind of shed some light with our audience today about that project.
Yeah, sure. So I'm working on biomass projects in several Southern African countries like Namibia, South Africa, Eswatini, but this one in particular is Mauritius, where Mauritius is having an ambition through they call it the National Biomass Framework, to phase out coal entirely on the island by 2030. And as you might know, they do have a massive sugar industry. So they have various sugar millers, sugar estates, sugar production companies, which is using bagasse as a residue from sugar milling. But there is not sufficient biomass. So they use some significant volumes of coal for the processes, but also to produce energy for the island. And that coal volume from those sugar millers is now foreseen to be phased out and to be replaced by biomass. And as part of a wider team, a wider legal and engineering team, as led by the African Development Bank, we are supporting the government of Mauritius in this total phase out of coal and conversion to biomass under some kind of a IPP, PPA, so independent power producers with a power purchase agreement structure, where the sugar industry in the end is then doing that conversion and selling that electricity to Mauritius. Yep.
Very interesting.
Maarten, can you tell us more about the feedstocks there, and if there's, I don't know if you're only using local or if you're, obviously Mauritius is an island nation, so how is the importing? How is the infrastructure? Are there challenges?
Yeah, interesting question, Jackie. So, yeah, Mauritius is not the only island having this kind of request. We have some similar islands, some of them part of the French territory. They have already done the conversion from coal to biomass. Mauritius is a project under development, so it's an early stage development project where we are supporting the government and the utilities on the island of Mauritius. And they're considering some kind of a phase out where instead of using wood pellets, where some other islands have done the conversion from biomass to wood pellets, which is a product we know works, but also which is a product which is pretty expensive. And if it can be avoided, instead of using wood pellets, using wood chips, that would be, from a cost perspective, the preferred modus operandi. And that's what we are looking at in Mauritius. So looking at phasing out coal to wood chips and agri residues instead of wood pellets, But obviously, given the sheer volumes, and we might be looking at 1 million tons a year, that's not available in the country. So there's a bit of local biomass. Yes, there's a willingness to increase local biomass. Yes, wood chips and whatever kind of residues, but they will never be able to complement all the coal being imported actually now for those sugar estates, the sugar industry. So we would be looking at a model where instead of importing coal, we would import, or Mauritius would import, biomass or wood chips and agri residues from various origins, replacing coal, substituting some local biomass availability.
So, Martin, with that being said, then I would think that there's got to be some strategy around infrastructure, especially, kind of give our listeners an idea of the size of the island.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you have ports that are ready to receive pellets today and things like that? Or is that going to be required as you look at this project?
Yeah, it's critical. It's not only the origins of sourcing, where can you find the biomass, what is the quality, what is the pricing of the biomass, sufficient availability, but definitely that whole supply chain is critical to the success of Mauritius in the end to convert from coal to biomass. Luckily, they are importing already coal and fuel oil, but coal as a commodity, as a solid commodity. So they are well acquainted, well known with structuring, managing the importation of coal. But as we know that the energy content of coal is much higher than biomass, to replace a certain volume of coal, you need double, triple that volume if you go biomass, which means that the impact on the supply chain will be massive. So yeah, that's definitely what we're looking at. So they have a port, yes. They have infrastructure, yes. But importing all the biomass required to replace all the coal will definitely have a serious impact on the supply chain in the port, on the number of vessels coming in, on the discharge rate, storage, and in country, so the trucking impact, etc. on the road. We have been modeling all of that, so that is known. So part of converting the assets from coal to biomass, part of structuring an import portfolio of wood chips from several countries, mostly Southern African countries for wood chips. Definitely, aside from freight, there is this whole model of importation infrastructure at the port, which actually where it's the pinnacle where everything is coming together, right? All the biomass is coming together and all the biomass will be dispersed again.
So Maarten, how does your experience in Mauritius so far compare to some of the projects that you've been working on in mainland Africa? Are the challenges different?
Yeah, so what we see in Africa is that to date, actually, most of the biomass related projects were either very small, local, more like residential, either biogas or cook stoves and whatnot, but not so much industrial. If you're looking at biomass deployment, whether it's biomass production for fuel or biomass for power, there are a few projects, there have been a few projects in South Africa producing wood pellets for export. They've all been mothballed. Some of them are revitalized now, and hopefully they can have a second life of starting again producing wood pellets for export. What we do see, though, is some interesting developments for biomass to power on an industrial scale. So I'm not saying 1 or 2 megawatt. We've seen various projects, a few megawatt, but really like 20, 30, 40 megawatt electric, so power using biomass. So what we see there, for example, very interesting project in Namibia, where they're actually constructing now a 40 megawatt biomass power project using local biomass, using encroaching bush. That's all within the region of the power station. There is another project in Southern Africa as well, similar using local biomass. What makes Mauritius unique, you could say, compared to the mainland, is that they don't have that sufficient availability of biomass. So they need to work on structuring an import portfolio and managing that portfolio, where the other projects in Southern Africa, whether it's producing wood pellets coming from a catchment area of 50 to 100 kilometers from a certain region where you're producing, or producing power, again, coming from 50 to 100 kilometer radius, that's quite different. I wouldn't say it's easier from a logistical or infrastructure point of view, but the supply chain is way shorter. So what I see in mainland Africa is keep it simple. So keep your biomass close to where you're using it. That's what's been done now, and that's what's been done before. But to really increase the potential in mainland Africa, you need to have seaborne unlocking capacity, which means developing port infrastructure for export. So when it comes to, for example, Namibia, they have a massive potential to produce wood pellets and wood chips for export. But what is lacking actually is the infrastructure to export it. Same with South Africa. Yes, there is potential, but also the infrastructure for wood pellets would need to be exported. Wood chips there is, right? So South Africa is already exporting for 50 years wood chips for paper and pulp quality to China and Japan. So that is really like well established. But if we're going new supply chains, new commodities, new ports, definitely a lot of infrastructure needs to be developed. And that's quite different than what we see in Mauritius, where you could say almost all the infrastructure is already there. It just needs to be adapted to use biomass instead of coal.
That's very interesting, Martin, because, I would have thought vice versa, right? I want to get back to a piece of what you just said on developing that infrastructure. It seems like, when you're doing your analysis and strategy of one of these projects, the value add is much bigger than just biomass. It seems like when you're developing infrastructure, you're creating jobs, whether it be construction, whether it be, just port jobs and things like that. Does the government or maybe even businesses in Africa look at it as an opportunity to increase their GDP and stuff like that?
No, excellent question. And that's spot on, Corey. So what we see is that with the ambitions of African governments to go green, go renewable, you can go various options. We also see now PV and BESS, so battery energy storage, as some kind of a almost base load application, very technical, very structured, but not a lot of job creation. I think honestly, only biomass is the only technology where you can really create a lot of job employment, especially unskilled labor opportunities moving into skilled labor. And what we see, for example, in Namibia, there is a massive unemployment problem, and they're really addressing that properly. So I really have a lot of respect. But there are not a lot of opportunities for unskilled labor, where if you would go, for example, a industrial scale project, and that's what actually the government is doing with their own biomass to power project, using unskilled labor to harvest and process biomass for local biomass to power generation, that's already creating a massive opportunity for job employment. However, if you could expand that to export wood chips, or even wood pellets for that matter, or even black pellets for that matter, you will have even more opportunity for unskilled labor, but also an opportunity for skilled labor, for technical education, basically in the end develop the entire industry within not only Namibia, but the Southern African region. And I think that's an opportunity which might even be equally or more important than the other opportunities biomass could bring, which you could say are at par to wind or solar or whatever. But that job opportunity, additional value, is definitely something which is not so much on the radar, I think, in the global north, but definitely now is on the radar in the global south, so in the countries itself. And especially, for example, Mauritius looking at Namibia as a potential supplier of biomass could bring also job employment in Namibia, in addition to structuring a supply chain together.
Do you have any advice for international companies outside of Africa that could be looking to engage with, countries in Africa that are making this switch, or that could be suppliers?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I've been asked that question many times before, and what you see is I'm coming from the European utility sector, and we have been looking at Africa, and we have seen the opportunity, but we have also seen the risks. And ultimately, when it comes to a board decision, I don't know what happens, but many times the risk overtakes the opportunity. So in the end, you have a decent, a well-structured project with a good EBITDA, with a risk mitigation strategy, but really to make the call to make that investment, there are few in the end who are doing it. Actually, I've done it before with my previous employer to invest in a wood chipping operations in Cameroon for export to Europe. But there are only few who are doing it. And if you would do it, I would say the opportunities definitely are there in Africa. And as I said, it's not only about the EBITDA prospect and the job creation, But honestly, I think if you have a well-structured risk mitigation plan, and if you're looking at partners, local trusted partners, as well as infrastructure partners, honestly, I see a lot of opportunity in Africa, because the problem with many biomass projects is that if you start at feedstock, which is your starting point, there are few countries or few regions where there is still an abundant supply of feedstock to start with. And if you're short feedstock, you can structure whatever you like and you can de-risk whatever you like. But if you're short feedstock, I've seen many projects strand just because of shortage of feedstock or a massive increase in pricing of feedstock. Southern Africa, I think honestly, is one of the few regions where there's still an abundance of high volume, decently priced feedstock to structure a project. So if you can link those dots, infrastructure, local partner, risk management, I think you can structure a project which will bring you even a better margin, much better margin what you could get in the global south with, if you structure it well, a slightly higher risk portfolio profile, but not so much actually. So your risk to reward profile should be better if you do a good job than many other projects in the global north.
So to reiterate, Maarten, one of the questions we had was talking about demand and what is driving the growth of the industrial biomass movement in Africa and Asia, right? So you just hit on something that I think for many of our listeners will be applicable around investment decisions and risk versus reward. From an investment strategy perspective, if I'm an investor or a stakeholder, what are some of the key factors that you want to consider when you're investing in projects in Africa versus Asia?
Thank you, Corey. I think it would be good to maybe compare Southeast Asia, in particular Vietnam, but also countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia, and as countries to invest in for wood pellet production or even biomass to power, but primarily wood pellet production with Southern Africa. So we have seen a few wood pellet plants in South Africa. Unfortunately, they didn't succeed. They were stranded, mothballed. One actually is trying to be revitalized now. And if you look at the comparison between Southern Africa and Vietnam, Vietnam being number 2 industrial wood pellet producer in the world compared to South Africa, and other countries where there have only been a few wood pellet producers in South Africa, is that from a feedstock perspective, there might even be, and honestly, I think there is more feedstock availability in Southern Africa than there is in Southeast Asia, where the starting point of any biomass project, biomass for fuel or for power, is feedstock availability, control over your feedstock, is that it would make sense actually to look at where the feedstock is. So look at Southern Africa and not look at another project in Vietnam. But I think part of the story is legacy. And the legacy, the track record in South Africa and Southern Africa in general is not so positive. Where in Vietnam and other countries, we do see some good projects there. So there's a better track record in South Africa. And I think investors would like to extend that track record instead of looking at new markets, especially new markets where they've tried before and have not been successful. So my advice would be take that knowledge from Southeast Asia and implement that in Southern Africa. And do it well second time, because the opportunity is there feedstock-wise. There are good partners to unlock the infrastructure for seaborne. Especially, there is now a quest for feedstock. I've been working with several utilities as a consultant to look for feedstock opportunities. So where can we find feedstock for chips or pellets aside from the usual suspects? And then you will end up in Southern Africa, West Africa, etc. So if we know there is a quest for feedstock in the future, especially if we're going biomethanol, etc., why don't you take that experience from Southeast Asia and try again and do it well in Southern Africa?
I'm a little curious. There's a number of countries that are switching over to bioenergy. So who really stands to win in this race to supply them?
Interesting question. I haven't thought about it. So this is a bit of a reply on the spot, so to say. I think you should start with where's your customer? So where's your demand? And that demand, especially with very long supply chain, is critical. So demand Southeast Asia is Japan and South Korea. Those are the two major markets. Japan is long-term, high quality, good prices, but very strict. South Korea is more like spot, opportunistic, but interesting opportunities. And what you see is that, for example, West Coast Canada is competing with Vietnam towards Japan and even South Korea. So if you could say the winners and losers, honestly, I think that Vietnam took certain volumes from West Coast Canada as a supplier to Japan. And Japan is moving from Canada towards Vietnam and other suppliers. However, Vietnam to Europe, for example, is a very long stretch. So you could say that there's a marginal supply of Vietnam into Europe. However, if you can free some volumes coming from that particular Pacific basin and keep it in the region, you can free up some other volumes to supply, for example, the European market or even the East Coast market. So in the end, it is a global commodity. Wood pellets it is. There is global trade. But I think that you should also look at certain hubs, so certain regions. So for example, again, if you look at Southern Africa, that will be very interesting to supply, for example, the Indian Ocean islands, even maybe supplying Europe. And for example, West Africa is a perfect candidate to complement Europe in their supply. I mean, it's a short haul. It's like a week, 10 days sailing from West Africa to Europe. So there you have definitely opportunity.
And we see some
Investment in that region for export. We do see some local project, but not so much for export. So if we're looking at winners and losers, I think any new catchment area, any new feedstock region where you can unlock the potential for seaborne trade should be a winner if they're at par on volumes. Because just as an anecdote, normally you say if you buy more, the price is lower. Honestly, in my work, if you buy more, the price is higher, which seems to be contradictory. But if you buy 100 KT a year, you might get a better price than if you buy 500 KT a year, because your low-hanging fruit is gone, and then you move up the price ladder, so to say. So winners and losers, it's a regional game instead of a global game.
Maarten, I think that's fantastic advice, and this has been extremely helpful. I'm sure our listeners appreciate your perspective, especially your around the different geographies and just your broad knowledge of the field. Do you have any last thoughts that you would like to share before we finish off today?
I mean, if I would be one item I would like to focus on with the audience, it's about feedstock, controlling your feedstock. So my advice would be start with where can you control your feedstock? Where can you find the opportunity to have sufficient biomass availability, have a credible partner who's controlling that feedstock, number one, and second, go for risk management. In the end, a biomass project is complicated. Sometimes it's really like, what are you doing to yourself, right? I mean, why don't you do a very simple PV or wind project? I love doing biomass projects, but control your feedstock, do your proper risk management, and then you should be able to have a good investment and enjoy a biomass project, even in Africa, even in Southeast Asia, aside from the global north, more mature projects.
Thanks, Maarten. I think your perspective is so valuable. Fantastic advice, and it's been a real pleasure having you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was great to join the show today.